We often hear tales of environmental decline and species slipping into oblivion. But there exists a quieter narrative, one of hope, resilience, and redemption. In this video, we're taking a look at the triumphant return of 5 remarkable species from the brink of extinction. The majority of species that are in peril today are in that situation because of avoidable human actions, such as poaching, deforestation, habitat destruction, and pollution. But the resurgence of the species in this video isn't just a testament to their own resilience. It's also a demonstration of the human capacity to make right what we have done wrong. Welcome back to All About Nature. On my channel, I try to bring nature-related content that's both educational and entertaining. If you like this kind of content, then please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. Now, let's get into the video. As the world has warmed over the last 30,000 years, and the glaciers have retreated, megafauna have taken a huge hit. 65% of the world's megafauna have gone extinct in recent millennia, with many of those that remain struggling to hold on. In the steppes of Central Asia is a species of ungulate that managed to survive, the Saiga Antelope. This species used to range from the British Isles, across Eurasia, and even into parts of North America. They live in massive herds that can be hundreds of thousands of animals strong, and they're known for their impressive migrations across the grasslands of the north. But as human populations grew and expanded, the Saiga antelope began to lose much of its range. By the 1850s, their range had been significantly reduced, but they were still extremely numerous in certain areas between the Ural Mountains and eastern China. Unfortunately, it was around this time that the species began to be hunted at unsustainable levels. Across their range, the great herds began to decline. To make matters worse, there was a growing demand for their horns, which were selling for higher and higher prices. By the 1920s, the species had been entirely eliminated in Eastern Europe and China, and in the areas where they had traditionally remained strong, they were teetering on the edge of extinction. Over the rest of the 20th century, the population fluctuated between near extinction and a couple of million animals. Saiga antelope generally give birth to twins, so when they're left alone, they can quickly recover. But in 1991, it was a political event that almost spelled the end of the Saiga antelope once again. The USSR collapsed. The majority of the Saiga antelopes lived within the borders of the former Soviet Union. With its collapse, millions of people plunged into poverty, resulting in a huge uptick in hunting of native fauna. At the same time, Chinese demand for rhino horns was causing a huge problem for endangered species. Conservation groups around the world wanted to find a safe alternative to rhino horn. Because the Saiga antelope population was strong at the time, the Chinese were encouraged to use their horns instead of rhino horns. While this did alleviate some rhino hunting, it almost spelled the end of the Saiga antelope. Within 20 years, the species saw a 95% reduction in population. By 2010, there were fewer than 100,000 animals left, mainly in Kazakhstan and Mongolia. To make matters worse, a bacterial infection caused 25% of the population to drop dead at once. This is what caused governments to begin to wake up to the plight of the species, and actions were finally taken to protect them. In 2011, Kazakhstan introduced a ban on Saiga antelope hunting. And it was this single action that likely saved the species. The population quickly began to rebound. By 2015, they had increased by 4-fold. But once again, a bacterial infection hit the herds. This time, 40% of the global population died in the course of 1 month. Oddly, from a bacteria that's normally harmless and regularly found in their digestive tract. Scientists aren't 100% sure how it happened, but they believe that unseasonably hot and wet weather, caused this bacteria to change its behavior. It then entered the bloodstream of the antelope and caused them to hemorrhage and die. Thankfully, the species hasn't experienced a mass dying event since 2015, and today the population of Saiga antelope has rebounded to about 2 million animals spread out between the two subspecies in Kazakhstan and Mongolia. While they continue to face the threats of poaching, habitat loss, climate change, and bacterial infections, the Saiga antelope is on a route of continued recovery. In fact, the IUCN recently reassessed the species and downgraded them from critically endangered to near threatened, as they've shown such remarkable recovery. The bald eagle is one of only 2 species of eagle found in the United States and Canada. With its beautiful white head and tail and impressive wingspan of up to 2.3 meters, or 7.5 feet, it's been the national symbol of the United States since 1782. But there was a time when this majestic bird was almost wiped out. In the 18th century, it's estimated that as many as 500,000 bald eagles called the lower 48 states of the USA home. But the human population in the US was booming, and settlements were expanding. Throughout the 19th century, much of the eastern United States was deforested to convert land for farming and urban development. This had a devastating effect on the bald eagle population. The species relies on large trees to build their nests, but with no more large trees to be found, they disappeared from much of the country. At the same time, farmers were worried about the presence of the eagles. They didn't want to lose their livestock to them, and even feared that the bald eagles were capable of carrying away their small children. They began to shoot the birds whenever they got a chance, and this continued for over a century. In 1918, the bald eagle became a protected species in the United States and Canada. And in 1940, it received full protection from hunting and trapping. While the ban should have allowed the species to recover, the greatest threat was just about to start. During World War II, insect-borne diseases were threatening troops stationed in tropical regions. In 1939, Swiss scientist Paul Hermann Müller discovered that a compound known as DDT was an extremely effective insecticide. The US Army began to use it in an effort to protect the troops from mosquito-borne diseases. After the war, it became commercially available and began to be widely used in the US, promoted as a safe way to protect crops. In fact, some states even sprayed people with it in public spaces in a misguided effort to eradicate polio. But DDT had another devastating side effect. As it ran into the groundwater, it accumulated in streams, rivers, and lakes, where it contaminated fish stocks. These fish were then consumed by bald eagles, and the DDT began to build up in their systems. The insecticide interfered with their ability to metabolize calcium. This caused the eagles to either become sterile or to lay eggs that had extremely thin and weak shells. Just a slight bump would break the egg. With almost no chicks hatching, the species fell into a rapid decline. Within only about 5 years of DDT being used commercially, the bald eagle population in the lower 48 was down to fewer than 1,000 mature birds. But no one could figure out why. In 1967, the bald eagle was declared endangered. But the mystery of its decline was also finally solved that same year. Members of environmental groups had noticed that bird populations were heavily declining in areas where the commercial use of DDT was taking place. The Environmental Defense Fund began to pressure governments to ban DDT, and in 1972, they succeeded. A near total ban on the use of DDT came into effect, and eagle populations began to rebound. In the 80s and 90s, the bald eagle population was up to just over 100,000 birds. By the early 2000s, scientists stopped counting them because they had become so plentiful. In 1999, the bald eagle was moved from being an endangered species to being assessed as least concern, the lowest possible rating a species can get. There are now estimated to be over 300,000 bald eagles in the lower 48 states, as many as 500,000 in Canada, and about 70,000 in the state of Alaska alone. Off the coast of California, not far from the city of Los Angeles, is an island chain known as the Channel Islands. There are 8 in total, and despite being close to the mainland, they're actually home to a surprising number of endemic species. In fact, at least 145 species of plant and animal live only on this island chain. On 3 of the islands, San Nicolas, Santa Barbara, and San Clemente, lives one of these endemic species, the island night lizard. It measures up to 11 centimeters long, excluding the tail. They can be beige, gray, brown, or black, and their pattern can be mottled, striped, or a uniform color. The species lives in dense scrub found along the coasts of the island, but their habitat began to change in the 1800s. Fur traders from indigenous groups located further north noted that there was an abundance of sea otters around the islands. They began to try to hunt there, but the local indigenous peoples of the islands didn't approve, and fighting broke out. Over the course of only 50 years, all of the indigenous groups on the islands were either killed off or moved to the mainland to live in Spanish missions. Once the islands had been emptied of the indigenous people, farmers moved in and brought with them sheep, goats, pigs, and cats, as well as a wide range of non-native trees and plants. The native wildlife of the islands suffered greatly, and the island night lizards were left at critically low numbers. In 1977, the US government decided that something needed to change on the islands in order to protect the unique wildlife that they host. Within 3 years, the government managed to establish the Channel Islands National Park, which encompasses 5 of the islands in the chain. This included Santa Barbara, one of the 3 islands the lizard lived on. Efforts began to restore these islands to their natural state. Meanwhile, the other 2 islands that host the island night lizard, San Nicolas and San Clemente, were under the control of the US Navy. They too were deemed of ecological importance, and the Navy also began restorative operations. Over the coming years, invasive animals, especially cats, pigs, and goats, were removed from the islands, and the degraded habitat began to recover. With it, the island night lizards bounced back. In fact, they've recovered so well that today it's estimated that over 21 million lizards live and breed on San Clemente alone. The species is now assessed as least concern, and it no longer requires protection under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. In the southeastern corner of the state of Florida is a small species of hairstreak butterfly, unlike any other in the region. Hairstreaks are normally gray or light blue, so the striking black, orange, and iridescent dark blue or green of the Atala butterfly really stand out within the genus. The Atala butterflies are large for hairstreaks and found in open, brushy areas in southeastern Florida, the Florida Keys, Cuba, the Bahamas, and the Cayman Islands. While it's well studied in Florida, very little information is available about the status of the species in the rest of its range. Atala butterflies are closely tied to the only native cycad in the United States, known as the Kunti palm. The males will form a small group around a host plant and wait for females to come by. In Florida, the entire life cycle of the Atala butterflies revolves around this single species of cycad. The Kunti palm is toxic, and by consuming it, the larvae also become toxic, developing a bitter taste for would-be predators. This toxicity remains into adulthood, and their bright colors remind predators to stay away. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, settlers to the area realized that the root of the Kunti palm was starchy and edible. Throughout Florida and the Bahamas, the plant was harvested for human consumption until it was almost gone. With its disappearance, the Atala butterfly disappeared as well. In 1936, the species was observed in the United States for the last time before it seemingly went extinct in the country. But 20 years later, in 1959, a small population of the butterflies was rediscovered, still holding on near Miami. Around the same time that the butterflies were being rediscovered, Florida was experiencing a boom in population growth. This is normally a problem for wildlife, but on occasion, human development can actually have positive effects on a species. Private and public gardens were using Kunti palms more and more, as well as several exotic species of cycad. And with the increase in popularity of cycads in urban gardens, the Atala butterflies slowly began to recover and spread. By 2019, the butterflies were being observed as far north as Orlando, where they weren't known to occur before. In fact, they've become so locally common in the state that in some places they're actually considered garden pests, with the larvae destroying ornamental cycads as they feed on them. The recovery of this species highlights the importance of using native species in urban development and gardening, as it allows native wildlife to continue to prosper. "55 kilometers off the north coast of New Zealand lie the Three Kings Islands. For centuries, the Maori inhabited them, but the first written record of the islands is from the first European visit in 1643. Dutch explorer Abel Tasman went ashore to look for water, and he noted that about 30 to 35 Maori lived on the Great Island, that they were growing tubers as crops, and that he didn't see any trees. Scientific expeditions to the islands began over 200 years later, when Thomas Cheeseman visited in 1887 and 1888. He made detailed notes of the plant life he saw. 70 years later, two other scientists, Graham Turbot and Geoffrey Buddle, returned to the islands, but they noted that the ecology of the forest had changed entirely from the description that Cheeseman had made. For one, the Maori had used fire to repeatedly clear the forest for cultivation, and to make matters worse, goats had been introduced to the islands. Turbot and Buddle also explored for new species. While walking through a seriously degraded forest, they saw a plant on a steep cliff that they didn't recognize. It looked like a tropical vine with thick, glossy leaves, a woody stem, and it stood about 10 meters tall. They went back the next year in the fall and noticed that this time the vine was flowering with long, light green flowers growing directly out of the stem. They could tell from the flower shape that the species was likely pollinated by bats, which they found strange because no species of bat was known to live on the islands. This time, they took cuttings of the vine and brought them back to the lab to try to grow more of the plant. They also proposed to local governments that the goats should be eradicated, and within a year, they were all removed. The vine was described as a new species and given the common name Three Kings Vine. The cuttings grew rapidly, though it took nearly a decade for them to begin to flower and produce seeds. Meanwhile, other expeditions to the islands failed to find any more of the plant, and the only one that they knew about was beginning to struggle. With the goats gone and changes made to the ways the Maori farmed the island, the forest was rapidly regenerating. This meant that the trees around the cliff that the Three Kings vine was growing on were getting fuller and taller, blocking out the sun. As it turns out, the Three Kings vine requires full sunlight in order to flower. Over the next 50 years, the only known wild Three Kings vine continued to suffer, never flowering and never having another specimen discovered. In the early 2000s, some researchers trained the vine to grow taller, and for the first time in over 50 years, the wild plant managed to partially flower. Meanwhile, the species was becoming more and more popular for the home garden. Today, the Three Kings vine can be found in gardens across New Zealand, where instead of being pollinated by bats, it's pollinated by local birds. Still, no other specimen of the vine has ever been found in the wild, and the original vine is still growing on that cliff in the shade. It's believed that the destruction of the island's native forests likely wiped out a native bat species that the Three Kings vine relied on. Then, when the goats were introduced, the remaining plants were all eaten, leaving the single remaining plant unable to produce fertile seeds ever again. The Three Kings vine will likely never be able to thrive again in its native range. It's currently assessed in New Zealand as nationally critical, which is equivalent to being critically endangered. But thankfully, it's extremely common in horticulture, and will likely remain so thanks to the plant's beauty and its resilience. And that's it for today's video. What other species do you know of that have been saved through conservation efforts? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to watch another video about 5 species that have been brought back from the brink, click the link at the end of the video. I also need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to join us on Patreon, hit the link in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.